So thank you for everyone for attending. My name is Sandy Adams. I'm a lead financial planner and partner here at the center. And we are happy to have Dawn Schluter and Jamie Oldham from Schluter and Hughes, who are a law firm here locally. And I want to let them introduce themselves and the unique firm that they have, because they have some pretty unique things going on at their firm. But before that, just a couple of housekeeping items. We are going to save questions for the end of the presentation, if that's okay. So go ahead and jot those questions down, and we'll make sure they get answered at the end. And then a couple of things, just we've got some resources sitting in front of you. Make sure to take a good look at those. If you have any questions, feel free to ask us at the end there. And a couple of other things. We've got some books that I'm going to set out by Gary, some books that we recommend a lot to clients that might be helpful. Crucial Conversations, which is a book that we recommend if you're having conversations, difficult conversations with your family, applies to this topic. If you're having difficult conversations with your family around patient advocacy, estate planning, end of life issues, good book to be reading. Start Where You Are, A Guide to Compassion for Living, a good book. Grief and Healing Against the Odds, which is a book that was written by Peter Lichtenberg. We do a lot of work with Wayne State University Institute of Gerontology. If you've lost a loved one or going through any kind of grief process, Peter actually wrote this book as a personal experience that he's had in losing a couple of spouses actually already in his short life. And then Parent Care Conversations. So if you are someone who is helping elderly parents and you're preparing for that process or want to help start preparing for that process, this is an excellent book to start those conversations with them. So I will set these out by here if you're interested in getting these books or want to know more about them. I'm happy to have those talks with you. Also, we have a couple of documents that we recommend to our clients. I'm sure these ladies have similar documents they use with their clients, but letter of last instruction and personal record keeping documents, which are just documents to start documenting things that you have, where are they, and what do I want to happen at the end of my life that aren't part of the legal document, but things you want to pass on as either where your documents are or what I want to happen at end of life to someone who's next in line to take care of those things for you. If you'd like either paper copies or electronic writable PDF copies of those documents, I'm going to send around a sign-up sheet, and we'll be happy to get those documents to you. And with that, I'm going to hand this over to Dawn and Jamie and let them get started.
Thanks so much. I guess we'll start just by doing an introduction to ourselves so you know who it is that's talking and what we might know about the subject that we're talking about. I'm a lawyer. I've been a lawyer for 34 years, I think it is now. I spent my career at a very large law firm doing nothing but estate planning work. So I was the head of the Trust and Estates Group at a big firm for about 20 years. And last year, January, so I guess that's 15, 16, 17 months ago, something like that now, I left the big firm and my name is now on the letterhead. I'm Dawn Schluter and in the Schluter and Hughes law firm. Our firm started out with, sort of a handful of people, and within a very short amount of time, we have grown. We have 4 lawyers. We have a lawyer who will become a lawyer rather next December. She's in law school. We have a number of paralegals, and we have something that other law firms don't have, and which I never had in my career previously, and that's called a care coordination team. Jamie's the head of our care coordination team. She's the director. I'll let her introduce herself in just a minute. Just a few other things I want to say about myself. I have an LLM in taxation. That's a graduate, post-law school degree. So I spent a lot of my career talking about estate planning documents, complex trusts, tax issues, and some of the other things that you may have already heard about from your estate planning attorneys. But what I didn't spend much time talking about was care coordination. So I'm in a really unique position, having many years of estate planning under my belt, but now being in an environment where care coordination is a big part of what we're offering to our clients. And so we're going to talk about, that is the subject matter for today, the care side of the things, the patient advocate designation, what your patient advocate should know. That's the title of the talk today. Let's hear Jamie introduce herself, and then we'll kick into the presentation.
Thank you so much for coming and spending this beautiful sunny evening right here with us. There's wildfire haze, so it's not too bad. So my name is Jamie Oldham, and I'm a registered nurse. And so I've had my days in the hospital. I've had a lot of days outside of the hospital on the teaching end, especially for new parents and newborns. And then I got into senior care, which has been a lot of fun. And when the firm approached me and asked me to join the team, I kind of thought, these are some crazy smart ladies. What do they need me? I'm not going to go to court. And they said, no, we have a client that needs to go to the urologist. And I said, oh, what's so hard about that? Right? So here I am. So anyways, it's been a really exciting journey to kind of navigate and learn how many families need care management services in so many different aspects. Sometimes it's because the senior is what we call a solo senior. So they don't have a spouse that's helping care for them, or their patient advocates at a distance. Sometimes, as you know, families aren't always the most functional things, right? I'm sure none of you have experienced family drama before. So sometimes it's kind of coming in and being the neutral third party to kind of help us navigate what may be the best option for the senior. So it's been a really fantastic journey, and I enjoy every day of it. So we'll kind of jump on board here. I'm going to turn it back over to Dawn, and we'll really kind of get into some of the things that we're navigating and how you can help. Really my role right now is supporting patient advocates. And so that makes it my mission that everybody out in this world has a patient advocate named for them, because it's so important.
Structure how to move the thing.
Let's see.
So the topic is my patient advocate prepared?
This is not the advancer.
Somewhere.
My nation just happened. Or the sideline. I was a little afraid of which color to go.
Next, maybe we're done. Oh, it looks like it needs us to click that. Now maybe. There we go.
Yeah.
So as an estate planning attorney, I have spent my entire career really worried about the things that are up here on the board. And again, some of you have probably heard of these terms: a revocable trust, a living will, a durable power of attorney, and a patient advocate. This is the way I tell the story. I spent so much time being worried about how my clients' assets were titled, and were we going to avoid probate? And did we like the trustees that we picked, and who was getting what inside of the documents? I spent my career focused on the trust plan, who's going to get what. And this is a very important part of what my clients and all of us should be worried about. I view estate planning this way. Estate planning is simply telling the people that come after you what you want and how you want it done. So while we're alive and well, all of us should be doing this, saying what we want to have done. We should make it as clear as possible, and we should make it as easy as possible. Because when it's not clear, then things happen. And when I say things happen, if we haven't done some of this planning, there are opportunities for you and your family members to find themselves in the probate court arguing over what should happen. And when I became a new lawyer, one of the cases I had, and I tell this story almost every time I speak, when I became a new lawyer, I was involved in a case that went to the Supreme Court of the state of Michigan. So Michigan Supreme Court, it went to the trial court, it went to the Court of Appeals, then it went to the Supreme Court. And the issue that was involved, it was for someone who had never done planning, so they weren't a client, but they came to us after the problem started to unfold. Mom and dad were both in a nursing home. Mom was failing. Dad was not doing great, but mom was really failing. They had not done a patient advocate document. They had not done a patient advocate document at all. And if you don't do a patient advocate document and you need somebody to make medical care decisions for you, there is only one legal mechanism for that to be done, and that is through a probate court proceeding to appoint a guardian. So this thing here called the patient advocate, or sometimes also called the medical durable power of attorney, is what you put in place to tell the whole world, who do you want to have in charge if you can't make your own care decisions? Everybody who is over the age of 18 should have one of these. I've talked on television, I've talked on radio, I've talked in schools. Everybody, when they turn age 18, should have one of these, and you should have one your entire lifetime. And tells us who you will have make decisions if you can't make those decisions. So back to that lawsuit I was involved in when I was a new lawyer that went to the Michigan Supreme Court. What happened? The mom was failing for sure. She needed someone to make decisions for her. Of course, her husband, who had been married to her for many, 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 many years, they only had one child together. It was a child they had in common. So small family. The husband thought he was the best person to make medical care decisions for his mom. Well, lo and behold, they had one son, and the one son thought he was the best person to make medical care decisions for his mom because his dad was also failing. So guess what? The son went to probate court to get himself appointed as guardian. The father contested that appointment. The father said, this is my wife. I've been married all these years to her. I'm the best person to make medical care decisions for her. But they litigated that issue in probate court. Lo and behold, the court appointed the son because he was younger, a little bit more able-bodied, and the father was admittedly failing some. The father was so upset. He went back to his estate planning lawyer, which was by then, of course, us. And he said, I need to prepare an estate plan that leaves my assets to the person I want to have them. And it was not his son. He left $4 million, which in 1989 was quite a lot of money. It still is a lot of money, but in 1989, it was a lot more money than it is today. As you all know, the financial people in the room are like, oh, that's a lot of money. He left all of his money to the state of Michigan general fund. All of it. And this, when he died, was a subject that hit the son quite poorly. So the son contested his father's documents. The father was held at the probate court trial level to have had mental capacity to prepare those estate planning documents, and the documents were upheld. The son took the case to the Court of Appeals. At the Court of Appeals, the documents were again upheld. And he appealed to the Michigan Supreme Court. And at that point, the state of Michigan threw up their hands and said, let's settle. So ultimately, that case resolved itself. The state of Michigan received part of the assets. The son received part of the assets. The lawyers, frankly, received a lot of the assets, and the litigation went on for 10 years. So this is an example of not making it simple, not making it clean, not telling us what you want to have done while you're alive and well. If only Mama had said in a patient advocate that she picked her husband first, none of that would have happened. None of that would have happened. So I'm a person who, for the last probably 15 years, have just spent a lot of time making sure that everywhere I go, I'm talking about the importance of this document. everybody who between the age of 18 and the time they pass should have one in place. And they should make sure that their patient advocate has a copy of the document and it's in a grab and run position, right? If I'm in a car accident, I want my patient advocate to be able to grab and run to where I am. And so as an estate planning lawyer, I have always focused on this document. And I spent a lot of time in my career. Remember, I said I'm down here talking about assets and taxes and funding. And we would spend hours talking about this. And then we do this very important document. And I would hand it to my client and I'd say, here it is. Make sure your patient advocate has a copy of it. You want it to be in a grab and run condition. And we joke about it and say, this is the pull the plug document. So make sure they, keep it someplace and they know their names. And I didn't do much more than that. Sometimes we would talk about uploading it to the hospital system, like if you're always in the Beaumont system, which is now something else, and I'll never get the name right because it's a silly name. Sorry, that's I'm responsible for naming it. But you can upload your patient advocate to my chart, for example, so it's always on file. Some of my clients drive around with it in the car if they're traveling a lot. I have clients that put, and I think this is very smart, a card inside their wallet with a note that says my patient advocate is, and then the phone number, your driver's license, your health care or your health insurance, and the patient advocate information right together in your wallet, because if you're in a car accident, what are they going for? They go for your wallet. They want to know who you are, and they're looking at your identification and, of course, your insurance information right away. If you got your patient advocate information right there, that's good too. I mean, you could tattoo it on your body, but that seems a little extreme, right? So these are things that I've always talked about. In my new firm, we'll talk about some of these. Well, let's not talk too much about these other documents. We've got screens on them. I mean, when we're talking about the patient advocate responsibility, just so I cover this, it's really important to make sure you've got all these other documents in order too, right? Because if you're out of commission, we have to make sure not only are there going to be people there that can make your medical care decisions, but people can pay the bills. They go hand in hand. And sometimes your ability to pay bills and handle your finances is not tied to your ability to make medical decisions. They're not exactly the same decision-making functions. So for a patient advocate designation to become operative, under Michigan law, you have to have 2 doctors certified that the person's incapable of making their own care decisions. So as long as you can make your care decisions, you're in the saddle. And let's talk about that a little bit. There's a lot of shades of gray. That's the big thing to say. There's a lot of shades of gray. So if I've been in a car accident, I might not be a person who's mentally incapacitated, but I'm in shock, I've been injured, and so I'm not thinking straight. And there's a document that wasn't on the screen before called a HIPAA waiver. And whenever I do a patient advocate designation, I do a standalone, separate document called a HIPAA waiver. And what that document says is, dear doctors, you are authorized to communicate with all of the people inside my patient advocate and maybe a few other people, because it's a pretty good idea. And you can second this, Jamie. When you're in the hospital, you want people to walk into the hospital and be able to communicate with the doctors, right? What's going on here? What's going on? I want to know what's going on. The more people you have that have legal authority to communicate, I think the better. Of course, the doctors don't necessarily love it if there's a lot of people barking, what's going on. If you've got the legal document, there is that ability to communicate, and the hospitals, the caregivers have to honor. So this thing called a HIPAA waiver goes hand in hand with the patient advocate document. They're both super critical. The thing about the power of attorney, it's got different trigger mechanisms. So your financial power of attorney is important because it can give somebody the ability to make medical or financial decisions for you. But the trigger mechanisms can be completely different. That can be effective on signing. So someone doesn't have to wait for me to be incapacitated, but can jump in and sign a contract, for example, for me, or could pay bills for me. And that's true on your trustee documents as well, perhaps, depending how that's set up. And have someone that's coming in to help you. Sometimes as my clients get older, and maybe some of you have seen this in your own families, they realize that things have gotten difficult for them, more difficult than they were 10 years or 15 or 20 years old earlier. And I know this in my own life. I used to be able to run a 7-minute mile. I don't run the 7-minute mile anymore. I had a client come to me a few years ago and she said, I paid my real estate tax bill twice. And it was a big number. And I didn't put it in my checkbook and I kind of forgot to do it. And then I paid the tax bill twice. And I've noticed some other things that I've been slipping on. I think I need somebody to come in and act with me as a trustee now to help me, pay bills and do things. I'm doing it fine right now, but I think I want to make sure I have someone at the ready, in the saddle already. So there's lots of things you can do in your planning documents to make, this trigger of when people can come in and help you financially, coincide with your needs. Again, this idea of telling us what you want, making it clear, and avoiding the people who are around you trying to figure it out for you or overlay their own desires and intentions. Like, mom would have wanted me. I hear that. I was always the one who. Well, everybody sees things through their own colored glasses, right? And, people, my brother wasn't in town. He never lifted a finger. I hear lots of these comments and somehow this is driving, the planning from the bottom. It should be that all of us are responsible for saying, here's what I want. Here's who's in charge. These are my instructions. And that's when families work the best. I mean, we have a lot of families that have interesting and sometimes difficult relationships. Again, the more clarity that you get from the top down, the better. Very powerful for me as a estate planning attorney when I sit with family, maybe children. Well, mom and dad are not in a position where they have capacity anymore. And I said, this is what your mom and dad said. It's very clear. This is what they want. It's a very powerful message. And, children who sometimes are like this, kind of fall into line. It's very interesting. But without the clarity, you get this overlay of what everybody thinks mom and dad would have wanted or what their sister would have wanted or whomever. So there's, lots of interesting emotional dynamics that we see surface at these points in time. And again, we could probably skip the slide. It talks about the things. So let's talk a little bit more about the patient advocate and how we got to where we are. And then I'm going to turn it over to Jamie. So in my old firm, in my old life, I would ask patient advocate to my clients that be sure to give a copy to the person you've named. Let them know that that's the document they'll use to pull the plug. They should keep it in a safe but accessible location so they can grab and run. Copies have the very same force and effect as the originals. So you can make as many copies of this document as you want. Electronic copies work just fine as well. And I didn't spend a whole lot more time thinking about, what goes into this on the other side. I didn't do what I had always done on the other side of the house, the financial side, worrying about the assets and what the value of the assets were and how they were titled and, how is it all going to play out? I didn't spend that time on this side of the house. And it's interesting to me how this evolved. I did have a client that I had served as her trustee and I took care of her. And I staffed the house she wanted to stay in her home. So I staffed the house with caregivers and it was very much her desire to stay in her home forever. That was And we managed to make that happen. She stayed in her home with the support we built around her for 5 years. And she passed away in her home. And I felt really good about what I had accomplished for her. She didn't have family. Her husband had predeceased her. And so I have a few other clients that named me in this capacity. And one of them is a gentleman. He's in a care facility. He had an independent living apartment. And I was named as his patient advocate and his trustee and his power of attorney because, I'm the option of last resort, right? This is, if you had someone better than me, you wouldn't take me. That's sort of how I look at it. And I joke because, we do make a very good choice for certain people, but I joke about it. So he was stuck with me because he didn't have a better choice. And I got a call, in the middle of the night, we're doing a transport to the hospital. There's been something, we don't know what it is, blah, blah, blah. And I said, okay, thanks for calling me. About an hour or two later, I got a call from the hospital. It was the doctor. And he said, we would like your approval to do an MRI. And I said, well, I guess you have my approval. I'm a lawyer. I don't know the first thing about medicine. I said, that's the right thing to do, right, doctor? And he said, yeah. And I went, okay. And then he asked me, or someone else called me, and maybe one of the staff called me to ask me if he had any metal in his body. And I said, I guess I'm not sure I know the 100% of the answer to that. I am not aware of any metal in his body, but frankly, I'm not sure he's told me everything. Now think about your families. Do you know everything about what's going on with your children or your friends or sometimes even your spouse? I mean, if you've named a child as your patient advocate, do they know what meds you're on today? Do they know who your doctors are today? So these are the types of things that, started to creep into my head. Like, I don't know enough. So when this client got discharged from the hospital, the doctor called me to give me the discharge information and said he needs to see a urologist. So this is the joke that Jamie just told. So he gets back to the house and I said, or back to his independent living apartment. And I said, okay, we got to make an appointment at your urologist. And he goes, oh. And I go, well, look, I don't know if you do it or I do it, but somebody better do it or we're both going to be in trouble with your doctor. And sort of where, Jamie came in. I was introduced to Jamie. I was actually not working at the Schluter Hughes Law Firm. I've used the Hughes firm as a vendor. I absolutely use them as a vendor. And as you get older, things get harder. They get harder. So could my client make his appointment? Yes, he could make his appointment. Could he get there himself? I suppose he would have had to arrange this transport. When he got there, would he have to relay what had happened at the hospital and why he was there? Yeah, that might have been a little bit more difficult, right? This idea of, you go to the doctor, you're like me here. A lot of people, you get there, you're like, I feel okay. The hospital told me come. We don't really come to some of those appointments with full candor. We don't come with our records. So I was introduced to Jamie, and it was proposed that she support my role as patient advocate. And I said, I don't know. My client really only loves me. I don't think they'll really like you. I don't know how this is going to work, but, well, we could try it.
Most people love what this likes.
And now when I get a call that, something's happened and there's a transport, which really I don't have anymore, to be honest, because what Jamie's lended to this equation is, we've avoided so many, what I would call catastrophes that would have not been avoidable. And for older people, one of the most severe risks is falling. And I fall almost every winter, right? Like I'm rushing around, I've got my silly high heels on, and I step on the ice, boom. Well, falling is super dangerous. People die when they fall. They end up in the hospital when they fall. They end up with broken bones. And, all of these things that, are, if you put the right things into place, are completely, I think, or at least largely avoidable. So that was my introduction really to this robust care coordination services. I'm bringing in somebody, and most of the people who get named as patient advocates are not medical professionals. Some families are blessed with that, right? Like if I had a daughter who was a doctor, my patient advocate has some expertise coming onto the playing field. Not every family has that. And even if my daughter was a doctor, she might not be here. So this idea of having boots on the ground with somebody you can be with the person to see what's going on and bring to the table this, knowledge that, most of us, frankly, just don't have is really something that, I get excited about when I talk about, because now I've seen it in play with, my own. I'm acting as a patient advocate. She's supporting me. We've done this for several years. I have clients that are using her to prepare their patient advocates, something she's going to talk about. And then patient advocates that she and her team are supporting as they are doing their role, just like she's supporting me. It's really, really something. And so what she's going to talk about is, getting your patient advocates ready to serve. And that's a really big piece. Okay, you go at it. She's wonderful. She's just the best.
Well, what is such a blessing too about that client though, is that he did name a patient advocate. The same situation if he would have avoided naming anybody, because there's a lot of people who are like, I don't have anyone to name as a patient advocate, so I'm just not going to have the documents done, right? And then we end up with probate. He would have probably ended up in a guardianship and appointed a guardian that he doesn't know, right? A complete stranger. So Dawn has done a fantastic job with this gentleman. He has nothing but wonderful things to say about her. So when you name your patient advocate and you are supposed to give them a copy of that document, let's be real, a lot of people don't, okay? So what does that person need to know though? It's not just, first of all, they do know that you named them, because there's a lot of patient advocates out there in this world that don't even know that they're named for their aunt, their uncle, their neighbor, somebody, right? Somebody that didn't feel like they had a person to name. But we need to tell them a lot more than just that they were named. Because if I have a heart attack right here, right now, and I get to the hospital and I can't speak for myself, somebody needs to know what's going on with me. What medications am I taking? What is my past medical history? Do I already have a heart condition? Am I on a blood thinner? And I know that this is, you may be thinking, well, gosh, it's like my niece that lives in Georgia that I've named as my patient advocate. That's okay, but she does still need to know these things because the hospital is going to call her. A lot of times people think as well, I always go to Henry Ford, West Bloomfield, and they have all my records right there in the system. They do. But I hope for your sake that you get to travel and you go on vacation and you leave the vicinity of Henry Ford, West Bloomfield at some point the rest of your life. Because if that's when your emergency happens, the hospital up in Harbor Springs or Traverse City does not have all the records on file like Henry Ford, West Bloomfield does. And they are relying on your information somewhere on your body or in your wallet or hopefully from your voice to be able to find out who your patient advocate is. So I am a huge supporter of an emergency binder. Okay, so this is something that we make with our clients. This is as the care management team. If you want to make your own, that's fantastic too. A lot of times, if you have to call the ambulance to your house, usually they look for things on the fridge, in the fridge, above the fridge. Sometimes people even put things on their front doors about where their emergency information is located. Because if I am the ambulance driver and I open this up, I can immediately see what your name is, that you live alone, and more importantly, that you have a code status on here that in this particular book happens to say do not resuscitate. Okay, and so we're going to talk about that in a minute. But knowing your past surgical history, is there metal in your body? Your patient advocate, like you heard, does need to know that. And it's a silly thing. Maybe you had your hip replaced or your knee replaced, and you haven't really thought other than, well, I can't go through the X-ray machine at to get on an airplane. but it's also really important if we're going to try to do an MRI in the hospital to understand what's going on in your brain, because you just had a stroke or anything else that has happened. I know your med list is always changing. If you don't want to put it in your binder, or if you feel like you can't constantly relay that to your patient advocate, what if you put like a shared document in your phone where both of you can access that? So as you're making updates to it, they can pull it up too. Because I realized if you called your niece in Georgia and said, okay, I just started a new medication, she's probably going to roll her eyes, right? But having her know where she can find that medication list is just as important. Right? My medication list is always hanging on the fridge, or it's always folded in my wallet, or it's on this drive in my computer. Whatever makes sense to you, that's something you want to relay to your patient advocate. You know, another important piece too is the HIPAA forms at your doctor's office. Maybe your patient advocate is not local, and you haven't really put their names on things, but if they have to step in an emergency to kind of start picking up the pieces, they need to be able to get that active medication list, or some of whatever happened with your last doctor's appointment. What kind of procedure did they just have? You know, they were just in for something and they were seeing their doctor. If you're named on those HIPAA forms at the doctor's office as a patient advocate, you can call that office and get that information. So being an emergency team, right? Being a patient advocate for someone is to be able to get the information to who needs it when they need it. The other thing too that I always put in these emergency binders for my clients, besides their medications and medical history, there's contact lists, contacts like for my children, for my patient advocate, but then those documents, that power of attorney document, because a lot of you may already be named currently as power of attorney for somebody, and I guarantee you don't quite carry that document around, okay? And that's okay. But knowing where you can quickly access it is what's really important. So the other thing you really want to talk about with your patient advocate, and this is a hard thing to talk about, and a lot of people don't like talking about it, so they don't, is talking about your advance directives and end of life wishes. But the reason we talk about these things now is so that we have a say in them. And if you don't want to have that talk, because I'll tell you what, as a daughter, like my mom starts saying, okay, I want to tell you when I die. I'm like, I don't want to hear it, Mom, but I know that I need to hear it. So what I can say, though, is write it down. Tell me where your wishes are. Write it down. Put it in the safe. Because discussing these things ahead of time allows you to have decision-making capabilities that hopefully will keep your family out of the courtroom later, right? But also things like, you know, whether or not you want to be cremated or you want to be buried, right? Some of these things are surface level, like, and I know it's hard to think about those things, but and some people can also get really deep. I'm totally excited to read this book that you're reading over here about Finishing Strong, which is all about advanced directives and relaying that information, but having thoughtful processes too with these things. Anytime too, as we age, sometimes different diseases come into play, sometimes terminal illnesses come into play. So those things sometimes can change what those advanced directives that we want done as well, and can change the conversation a little bit.
Can I interject here? Yeah. So this is the idea of, you know, what you're communicating to the people that are going to be responsible for helping you. I always want to stay in my house. This is so important to me. If it is at all possible, I want to be in my house. That's very, very much different than I really want to downsize and I want to move to an apartment in a senior facility. And, you know, sharing what you would like and where you would like to be. As if you want to move to an apartment, an independent living apartment, you might get a chance to effectuate that yourself. And then your family doesn't have to make those decisions, right? If you're in a place with a continuum of care, they know that's what you've chosen and where you're going to be. But if you don't tell your family, and we see some of this, we get to a point where we're in crisis mode, right? Like we can't send someone back to the house as we're discharging from the hospital because the house can't accommodate their needs unless we put all kinds of stuff into it right away. This idea of sort of thinking it through ahead of time, like what do I really want? If I could pick, what would I really want? I want a, in-law suite above my, son's garage, or I want to have 800 feet or 8,000 feet, or what is it? And sometimes it's hard for us to think that through. But if you don't do it, the people who come after you are really in a hard place. And it happens. It happens in so many families. And I'll tell the story of my own family. My grandmother and grandfather had been married their whole lives. And when my grandfather died, I went to go help because she was not well. I said, Grandma, does Grandpa want to be cremated or buried? She said, I don't know. We've never talked about it. Lawyer, my jaw hit the ground. But, I never thought it was my place to ask because, they've been married all these years. After all, I was just a granddaughter. But now I'm scrambling around. Well, Grandma, we got to make a decision. It's not like they tell you, well, get back to us next week after you think about it. You decision. Well, I guess that cemetery down at the end of the road would be okay. Can you call them? Yeah, I guess. I mean, all of these things at a stressful time and just become so much more stressful. So, some of my clients do all of their pre-planning, right? Like, where do I want to be? What are my arrangements for my funeral? Right down to, the music and the, and it's kind of, it's kind of weird to think about it. But, why should someone else get to pick?
And then
do you want a big party?
Afford it.
Do you want to have no party? Do you want it to be a published obituary? No obituary? Everybody's totally different. And one client come to me this year. You may have heard this story. She said she and her husband got their plots. They got their headstones. They're both alive, so they don't have the end date. And then they invited all their friends to come to the cemetery on a Friday night after, like, happy hour. They had a big party at the cemetery, and they all got to say the things they wanted to say about this couple. Well, they were all alive and well. And I said, well, now I've not heard of that one before.
No.
So everybody has a different dream of what that looks like for them. The part here about, what do you want for yourself while you're alive? Who's going to take care of you if you need help? Where do you want to be? And can you accomplish that? And trying it on for size. If you want to stay in your home and you need 24-hour care, we know what that cost is. It's way more expensive than being in a facility. And you maintain that cost. If the answer is yes, and that's what you want, have at it. If you need, like my client did at the end of her life, double duty, meaning she couldn't have just one person with her. She needed 2 8-hour shifts of double staff because she had a little bit of transportation issue and you can't really transport safely with one person. So we had round the clock care plus another 16-hour shift on top of that. It was darn expensive, but that's what she wanted. I didn't have to worry about, gee, am I going to spend too much money? She told me quite clearly at the front end, if you can make that happen, that's what I want. But other people would say, I'd much rather be in a place where, there's other people around me and we can go on, field trips together and I can go to the dining room with my friends. So everybody's different. Everybody's different. All right. Sorry.
You're fine. I appreciate it. Go ahead with you. So this is code status. Sorry, it's a little code status. I want to spend a few minutes talking about it because some people know what code status means. Some people's kind of heard it, but not really sure. And so, code status is not black and white. There's a lot of gray area in what a code status is. And it's really something that only pertains in the hospital, but yeah, it actually pertains outside of the hospital as well. Okay. So a full code. Me standing right here, I am young-ish, right? I am healthy. If my heart stops beating right now, I would want everything done to save my life. Okay. Code status only affects if your heart stops beating or if you stop breathing. That is the only things it pertains to. Okay. Now, if I was 88 years old and my mobility is very frustrating, I am now wheelchair bound. This is not what I saw myself as. Maybe I've had a few heart surgeries. I have a lot of heart conditions. I'm bouncing in and out of the hospital. Maybe this person decides that they want to be a do not resuscitate. Okay. Everybody has different reasons for being a do not resuscitate, or what we call in the hospital a DNR. Do not resuscitate means I do not want chest compressions. I do not want the paddles to defibrillate me if my heart stops or I stop breathing. Okay. Anybody in this room could make this decision today. And then we go to our primary care and we have a conversation with our primary care and we talk about it. A lot of times there are physicians out there that would say to one of their patients, based on their recurrent health conditions, based on their terminal illness, based on their frail status and how difficult CPR is, extremely difficult on the body to get that heart pumping again. You know, if I'm a full code, I might actually be intubated after I'm resuscitated just to allow my body to rest, right? This is hard for a body to go through. So sometimes as an elderly person, people make the decision that they do not want to be resuscitated. They do not want to go through that. So when you walk into the hospital for any type of procedure, or you come in through the emergency room, they want to know, are you a full code or are you a DNR? Okay. If you've talked to your primary care about it, and you could walk in that emergency room and you were a full code when you walked in, but you get in there and based on whatever diagnosis they just gave you, you could at that point change your decision. But a lot of people think a do not resuscitate means they're not going to take care of me then. They're not going to try to cure my infection. They're not going to do anything. No. A do not resuscitate only is important about your heart. If your heart stops beating or if you stop breathing. Okay. So if you've talked to your doctor about it, and then he gives you an order that's valid in the state of Michigan, we can actually get a piece of jewelry, which is a bracelet called a do not resuscitate bracelet. Because if I'm standing here giving this presentation today, and I know that I have stage 4 breast cancer right now, and I know that I have a very poor prognosis, and I probably will not live more than the next few months, and I know that I'm very ill from the chemotherapy that I've been on, and I do not want my heart resuscitated if I drop to the floor right now. If I dropped right now, someone's going to come up and do CPR on me, because that's what we're trained to do, right? We're told we need to resuscitate this person that just fell to the ground. But if I'm wearing a bracelet that says do not resuscitate, that's my way of communicating to you when I have no voice. No, please don't do that. You're still going to call 911, but we're not going to do chest compressions. We're not going to provide artificial airways, or we're not going to give the breaths if you were doing CPR on the floor, okay, out in the community. So code status is something that as we age, it becomes asked more frequently as well by our doctors and by the hospital. It is something that sometimes people walk in to the hospital and they had planned on being a do not resuscitate. But given the conditions of what is going on right now with themselves, maybe if we intubate them, we can be able to treat the flu better or whatever infection they have, right? So again, it's not black and white, because the doctors can talk to the patient about that. And the patient says, yes, I want that done. I want to be able to fight this infection. So,
and this is something that the patient advocate should know.
100%.
That's the key here. So once you're thinking about these things, it's important for your patient advocate to know. Your patient advocate in the written document may have authority to issue a do not resuscitate order, but giving them the authority to issue a do not resuscitate order is completely different than directing them to do so. And the document will not direct. It gives authority. And so the patient advocate's just like the patient. They're standing in this gray area, and they're getting information about the condition, and they're trying to understand what the prognosis is and everything else. To the extent you have some indications in advance that you can share with your patient advocate, that's very helpful. So, rudimentary example. I have had several clients that have come back from the dead, and that's my layperson way of describing it. I didn't.
They were resuscitated.
I've had a couple of clients that have been in long-term comas as well that have, regained their ability. I have learned more about the medical profession than I ever thought I will, simply by virtue of and it's not the medical profession, but, about medical things than I ever thought I would. So my conversation, at least right now with my children, and it's not necessarily this full code or do not resuscitate. I think I'm a full code. I guess I'm a full
You
code.
are.
I'm pretty healthy and I'm terminal. And so I guess I'm a full code, but I took the conversation a little beyond that. And I said to my kids, I give you the authority to, pull the plug inside of my document, but you know what? I now have a respectful belief in miracles, right? I didn't really understand that people could be in a coma and come back to life, and you'd never know. Like, I have 2 clients that have been in relatively long-term comas, and if you didn't know them before, you certainly wouldn't know anything happened to them. And knowing them before and knowing them now, you might see a small difference in the cadence of speech and so on. So back to, my instruction to my patient advocate is, 3 days on life support, I'm cool with that. 3 weeks, I could probably be good with that too. 3 months, I don't know. Depends what the doctor's saying. 3 years, I'm going to haunt you forever. Right? So it's not very sophisticated, but it's designed to help them. Because I don't want my patient advocate to look at the document and say, gee, I have authority to issue the DNR and pull the plug. Gee, I guess I better do that. Like, okay, you've got authority, but not so quick, right? There are so many, and that's where I missed the boat as an estate planning lawyer. I pass the document over, I said, here's your pull the plug document. But there are a million other decisions between all of us sitting here just fine and pulling the plug. And we don't know what any of those decisions are going to be. We don't know. And it's such an interface with the medical profession. And the more guidance you can give your patient advocate, even if it's sort of rudimentary like mine, by 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months, you're giving them something that is designed to help them. And the more of that you can do, the better.
Yeah. In your Schluter and Hughes folder, there is a lifelong journey, which kind of walks through what we talked about code status. It goes through code status again. But it also talks about all, like I said, the gray area. CPR we're really just talking about CPR and giving breaths and intubating because of resuscitation. There's a lot of other pieces in here that as someone's health changes, they may determine. I have clients that are adamant they will not go back to the hospital. So we put do not hospitalize on their records. Now that ultimately is probably meaning if we should probably consider hospice. That's another very difficult decision for the patient advocate to make, is that when is it time to bring in hospice? And so again, those can be part of your wishes as well when you're thinking about some of those end of life decisions, is whether or not you want to go ahead and bring in hospice. Dawn touched on this earlier as well about when that patient advocate becomes active. And so if this individual is deemed incapacitated by 2 physicians, meaning 2 physicians have said, my patient does not have the ability to make sound medical decisions anymore. Now the patient advocate is the one that is signing every doctor's appointment form, right? Is signing all the consents of the hospital. Patient advocate has taken over then at this point. And a lot of times we see this with dementia, with cognitive impairment, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, post-stroke, when you no longer have the ability to speak. And there's been huge cognitive changes following that stroke, okay? So a terminal illness, we kind of mentioned as well, can change what your opinion is on some of these things that we talked about in the hospital, such as the do not resuscitate order, such as whether or not you want to go to the hospital, okay? If you are at the end stages of a terminal illness, you may tell your patient advocate, no matter what, do not send me to the hospital, okay? And so the patient advocate has to navigate those changes like, well, what does that mean? I guess that probably means we need visiting physician services, right? We need hospice because the hospice would have our visiting physician services to carry out those wishes. Also, too, none of us in here are supposed to understand what the outlook is for this terminal diagnosis. So we want to talk about it with our physician. And what we talk about with our physician and what our physician is telling us is our prognosis, we want to share those things with our patient advocate. There are a lot of patient advocates that are in the dark about whatever current medical issues that the patient is facing. And then suddenly now we are in the hospital with a stroke and they didn't realize that there was this big long-term illness going on that they've already been fighting. So how can a care manager help the situation? So sometimes as an adult, we feel like, well, I don't want to name my daughter as my patient advocate because she has her own young children and I don't want to be a burden to her. We have some clients that come to us and say that, and we encourage them, you want to name that daughter, but you know what? You should have a care manager walk alongside of that daughter to help support that patient advocate. A lot of times when we are playing that role of patient advocate, especially if it's for our parent, if it's for a loved one, if it's for our neighbor, we might still have a full-time job ourselves, and we can't miss work every week to take them to a doctor's appointment, to help them navigate, anything, especially if we have confusion going on or we have some wandering and now we have to figure out how to make the home safer. So bringing in a care manager as a consultant can kind of help. Sometimes we draw out a whole care plan for a family, like, okay, we have dad is in the home and dad has dementia and mom is in the home too, and she is the caregiver. How can we support the caregiver? And what is the son who's going to be patient advocate? What happens if something happened to mom tomorrow? If mom falls and breaks her hip tomorrow, what are we going to do about dad? Because dad can't be left alone. So as a care manager, we want to try to look one step ahead and we want to try to build in that support system so that we don't have this scary moment of what do we do with dad because mom's going to rehab for the next 6 weeks to rehab from the stroke attack. So we come in and we gather all the medical information. We create a medical record, okay, for our clients, but then we also go as far as doing assessments of the home. Can we make this home, if you want to decide if you want to live in place, can we make this home accessible for the rest of your life? Let's have those difficult conversations that you haven't really wanted to have that patient advocate. Let's talk about death. Let's talk about where we want to be buried, if we want to be buried. Let's talk about if we're going to want to have hospice come into our home to care for us. So sometimes it's easier to talk with those things, the layperson, to a non-family member person that you're not emotionally attached to me, and we can have those tougher conversations together. And by all means, if that helps you and your patient advocate do this together, then I did my job, right? That's what I want, is to be able to help your patient advocate navigate this for you as your life changes. So this is what sometimes I call myself a chaos coordinator instead of a care coordinator, because really I'm balancing family dynamics, okay? Because we know any of us that have more than one children, we know that they don't have the same personalities, right? And so everybody brings a different personality to the table in a family, or maybe it's the neighbor next door that has been seeing how this person has been living and has concerns that the patient advocate is not doing their job. Okay. So we're managing everyone else's expectations. We're really strongly advocating for what the senior wants themselves. Okay. And we're trying to relay that information to the patient advocate, give the tools to the patient advocate they need, but also we're going to manage those doctor's appointments. We're going to know what the med list is and make sure that the specialists know what meds they're on. Are we managing medications safely at home, or do we need to bring in interventions for a safer med management system at home so that we're not missing doses or so that medications aren't getting into the wrong hands? So sometimes there's kind of a lot of pieces. Are we looking at moving into a senior living community? Is that what would be the safest option for our senior citizen that we're helping? So care managers can literally walk right alongside the patient advocate. And if you're really feeling like you are a burden to someone, you don't want to name someone as your patient advocate because you don't want to burden them, then give them the gift of a care manager too, because it's so important that you have a patient advocate to be your voice. And it's even more helpful, if you have a care manager that can be right alongside of them to help guide that voice, especially if they don't feel like they know the whole picture or they don't feel like they really understood what you wanted or what would be the best thing for you. Because it can be nerve-wracking to make decisions for somebody else. So we've talked a lot about the buried or cremated piece. Think about if there's things you want shared at your funeral. I think the best gift that any of us can give to those coming behind us is to prepay and pre-plan our funeral. I know it sounds morbid, but I had to pick out my dad's casket and I was like, oh gosh, my dad was always cheap, so I think we get a cheap one. I don't know, right? Like, you can make them yourself. So pre-planning your funeral, deciding if you're going to be buried, cremated, sprinkled somewhere, you want to be in a mausoleum, thinking about those things and telling somebody that you thought about those things, telling somebody that they're planned and this is where the paperwork is. So whether or not everything for you is in a safe or everything for you is in a binder, your patient advocate needs to know. A lot of us do put a lot of things in our phone. But what is difficult is that the Apple Store can't even access that iPhone. So what you have in that phone, you have to give that passcode and your Apple ID to that patient advocate or to somebody else so that they can get all that important information out of your phone. It's not even the Apple Store can do it.
If I can add to this, I'm a GMAT during her client relations. And so for me, I lost both my parents by the time I was 30. And my dad, I was pregnant with my first son. He had bone cancer. And for him, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm pregnant. I can take care of him and everything else. And then all of a sudden, I thought, what am I going to do for his funeral? I was like, Gina, don't worry about it. I want birds of paradise. I want Ave Maria at the church so he get everything laid out. He's like, you focus on your baby. I'll focus on this. And then I'll tell you, it's the biggest blessing that he ever gave me. He said, no, this is what he wanted. This is what he had written down. This is what he wanted. And it was, I will tell you, it is such a blessing to give that to your children. And they kind of laugh. They're like, Dad wanted the ham at the funeral. He got his ham. It's just those little things of what he wants. So I'm telling you, please get that extra step.
A lot of times too, especially if it's not our child that we have as the patient advocate and it's somebody else. Maybe it's our neighbor. Maybe it's our college friend that's going to be making these decisions. The more you can tell them ahead of time, the better. So lastly, just last month was National Healthcare Decision Day. I don't know if you can actually click on this video link with that pointer. And this can just kind of play in the background, but maybe not. That's okay. So I encourage you to encourage your friends as well to name their patient advocates. National Healthcare Decision Day is to encourage people to make those difficult decisions, to do that end of life planning, and to advocate that everybody has a patient advocate, because nobody wants to be appointed a guardian by the court, especially when it's a guardian that they don't know. It's much better to even your last. No, it should just play. So again, just encouraging that you too can advocate for all your friends, families, loved ones, that they too name a patient advocate so that they have a voice for themselves.